is remarkable how we can collectively overlook the obvious. For example, the way we live, the way we organise our societies, the shape of our economic institutions and our politics, our culture and values are neither accidental nor autonomous, in that they have emerged randomly out of some historical accidents, nor are they based on some foundational and absolute truth that this is the only way to run a society or economy. Rather, they're all simply a reflection of the stories that we tell ourselves. And the stories we tell ourselves are shaped by what we imagine to be true, or rather, the paradigms that we hold. And given the state that we're in and the hugely complex challenges we face on several fronts, including climate change and the overshoot of planetary boundaries, increase in inequality, we must surmise that the story we are telling ourselves is not a healthy one at all. In fact, it's a toxic story. A toxic story that finds its roots in the toxic paradigms that we hold to be true. The challenge is, of course, spotting this story, because these toxic stories that shape our culture, beliefs and values are all implicit. They exist at the meta-narrative level of everything that we do. Being able to see and perceive meta-narratives, as well as work with them, requires a different type of attention, one that we seem to have lost. This is the attention of a master storyteller, someone who can see and perceive the nature of meta-narratives and knows how to work at the meta-narrative level to bring about real and meaningful change on some of the greatest challenges we face today. This different and more perceptive attention can only emerge when we are willing to step out of the current paradigms that shape so much of our thinking today, and be willing to explore a new way of thinking and seeing our world from a different perspective. The challenge here is that, ironically, rather than being willing to leave old toxic paradigms behind, instead we tend to protect, guard and defend them, despite the harm they inflict not only on our world but also on our own selves. To leave toxic paradigms behind, we have to abandon the belief system that these paradigms provide, including the foundational belief that we are independent, autonomous, rational thinkers, that we come to understand reality only through our ability to think rationally. This is not an ultimate truth, but rather a reflection of the paradigms we hold. When we remain oblivious to the paradigms that shape how we think, which in turn shapes how we relate to the world around us, we will never be able to see beyond the reality that each one of these paradigms presents to us. Trying to solve some of the biggest problems by using the same mindset that caused the problems in the first place clearly makes no sense. This is called the paradigm trap, where we are trapped in the logic, values and thinking of the paradigms we hold, preventing us from seeing the deeper problems that lie underneath the surface of everything that we are doing. The result is that we tend to ask the wrong questions, and we seek solutions that never really take us anywhere, especially to the roots of all these problems we face today. Our rationalistic and technocratic mindsets will never really present solutions to climate change or global injustices as a problem to do with meta-narratives or to do with stories that we tell ourselves, because these mindsets don't believe that stories or storytelling play any serious role in shaping how we think and relate to the world around us. Instead, these mindsets will always seek technical solutions or logistical changes, using science and technology to try to resolve what is ultimately a relational problem. Rationalistic and technocratic mindsets will always draw upon their own logic to find solutions. Therefore, the tendency is to seek to inform and educate audiences on the problems we face, and show practical ways in how they can take action on these problems, with the expectation that what we are lacking is information or understanding. Most of our communications, campaigns and initiatives for social and positive change tend to draw upon the information deficit meta-narrative. The idea is that what we are lacking is understanding. Once we understand the problem, then the motivation will follow. That's the logic. While there's no evidence that this is true, we keep applying the same logic as a solution because we can't seem to think in any other way. These mindsets will always have difficulty in thinking beyond the reality they present to us. This is why it is so hard to get to the root of the problems we face, for these mindsets will always deny the reality that is beyond their thinking. For example, a technocratic and scientific mindset will have huge problems with accepting a deeper reality that underlines our current problems. The deeper truth is that we shape the world around the stories we tell ourselves, and we believe these stories to be true. These stories are communicated at the meta-narrative level of everything that we do, and these stories have the power to shape our values and behaviour. Therefore, it is not us who are in control, it is the stories. Until we recognise their undertow shift in everything that we do, nothing really changes. The story will always play out, and we will participate in their flow, not thinking that they even exist. In many ways, we are like fish who don't believe in the existence of water. Because meta-narratives are everywhere, they are implicit in everything that we do, and yet we can't see them. However, just like fish swimming through water, we live, move and have our being within these meta-narratives, never really seeing what is everywhere. Meta-narratives are received unconsciously and are communicated unconsciously. We participate in their flow whether we are aware of them or not. Meta-narratives are never values neutral. They hold huge sway over us at the pre-conscious level, and they have the power to shape the foundations of our beliefs, our culture, the way we relate to the world around us, as well as how we relate even to our own selves. These meta-narratives are even historic and can even be communicated and passed on from generation to generation. They can stick within the common psyche for thousands of years. They are the invisible hand shaping human history, and they are the invisible force that gives rise to some of the biggest challenges we face today, including climate change and social inequality, and a whole range of different issues causing harm to the world around us. And despite all this, we don't really think that they exist. Or if we do, we don't really take them that seriously. This is incredible if you think about it. Because we remain oblivious to them, meta-narratives hold incredible power over us. They have the power to destroy, or the power to heal, the power to dominate us, or the power to liberate us. And being able to work with meta-narratives is, I would argue, one of the most important things we can learn today if we are truly seeking to bring about positive change in our world. This is the role of a master storyteller. A master storyteller isn't about developing an expertise in storytelling as if we can somehow master the art of storytelling, but rather a master storyteller is someone who can work with shaping the master stories that sit under everything that we do. In other words, someone who can work with meta-narratives. This requires a specific skill set and insight. It requires the ability to shift to a different mode of attention, so that we can see through the explicit to see what values, beliefs and worldviews we communicate implicitly in everything that we do. This allows us a new lens through which to see some of the underlying drivers of our current problems, and more importantly, offers us new insights on how to fix them at the roots. A master storyteller understands how storytelling and meta-narratives play a foundational role in shaping how we think and relate to the world around us. With this insight, a master storyteller will know how to craft new meta-narratives and how to integrate these meta-narratives into everything that we do. Because we all participate in the flow of meta-narratives. We can either continue to promote toxic meta-narratives in the belief that they don't really make a difference, or we can start to take them very seriously and disrupt old toxic meta-narratives with new restorative ones. And in so doing, we can begin to tell a new story. This is the real beauty of storytelling. When we create a new story, or rather new meta-narratives, these stories hold their own power. They have their own sphere of influence. Good stories can influence others to tell the same story, if it resonates. And in the telling of a new story that aligns with the values of a positive meta-narrative, these stories can transmit and awaken the necessary values needed to bring about positive change in our world. And we can do this remarkably below the level of our attention. Learning the skill of a master storyteller can help every one of us play an incredible role here to help transition from telling and participating in the old story, the one made up of toxic paradigms and meta-narratives that are causing so much harm to our world, to tell a new story, one that works with new paradigms, new meta-narratives, to help create powerful dynamics that awaken the necessary values needed to bring about real and positive change in our world. But it is impossible to see that the water is polluted if we don't believe water exists. That's the problem here. Until we have an out-of-water experience, or in other words, to leave the dominant paradigms that shape how we see and relate to the world around us, until we leave these behind, we'll never really be able to see things as they are. We remain in the same polluted water, exhibiting the same symptoms that this polluted water inflicts on us, without any real understanding as to why things are the way they are. Each paradigm brings with it its own values ecology. Paradigms are never values neutral. When we hold paradigms to be true, not only do we accept their logic, but we also accept their values. And in doing so, we communicate these values at the meta-narrative level of everything that we do. With this insight, we can begin to see some of the psychological drivers that sit behind the problems we see. This is clearly where we need to focus our attention. Until we change the story at the meta-narrative level, of course, it is unlikely that we will make any meaningful change on the global issues we see today. Because from my experience of being on the front line of working for positive change for the last 20 years or so, is that our attempts to affect change at the political level without doing any interior work with challenging the paradigms or meta-narratives that gave rise to the problem in the first place, is that over time everything reverts back to pretty much where we started with. It's certainly the case with trying to tackle global poverty, and it's almost certainly the case with climate change. All these problems are expressions and symptoms of a toxic story, a way of relating and seeing the world, out of which our failure to change the story results in very little change at all, despite our best efforts to effect real change on these important issues. For example, we might advocate for policy change, let's say on net zero. The focus of our campaigning will be on getting that policy change, putting huge pressure on world leaders to make those commitments, doing a lot of shouting, a lot of research, and providing evidence as to why we need to change, and we might even use storytelling as a tool to persuade others to support the cause. In the end, we might get our intended results, and it seems like a victory, a win for humanity. But here's a problem. If we leave the underlying story, the meta-narrative, untouched, the same meta-narrative that gave rise to the problem in the first place, then the inevitable result is that all the hard work that we have put in place to bring about positive change over time slowly realigns itself back to what it was before, the old story. And all those politicians who are almost clambering over themselves to make big net zero commitments at major events, over time will only rescind, regress, water down, backtrack, and just completely fail to do anything meaningful about living up to those lofty commitments. And it's not just politicians, it's all of us. When we try to communicate the urgency of taking action on climate change, even when we dial up the temperature, shouting that it is an emergency, ever expressing the urgency of our current situation, even with threats to the very existence of humanity, it is amazing how these attempts fail to overcome the inertia that is widespread across society and our politics. So what is going on here? And more importantly, how do we fix it? The answer to this lies below the level of our conscious attention and can be found in the stories that we tell ourselves. The dominant story will always win, always. And until we change the story at the meta-narrative level, the old story will always grow back. Everything will realign itself to what it was once before. This is the nature of meta-narratives. Think of stories as the foundations on which we build everything. Everything we do above the surface is really a reflection of what lies beneath. Everything realigns itself to the foundations on which it stands. And these foundations are the master stories that we believe to be true. Just because they are below the surface of our attention does not mean that they are not there, and that they play a pivotal role in shaping our values, beliefs, and behaviours. When we believe that we are rational, autonomous beings, where we make calculated decisions on what is the best decision to make, a homo economicus mode of thinking, then all of our attempts to derive change on the big issues we face, all our campaigns, our initiatives, every story we tell, will be shaped by the information deficit meta-narrative. The foundational belief that if we provide the logical case to take action on the climate crisis, then people will act. The result is that we provide the stats and facts, we show the figures to back up our case, we turn to scientific reports to give credence to what we say, all the while the motivation for real change never really kicks in, because we are treating people like computers, not humans. The paradigm that we are rational beings is expressed at the meta-narrative level of every campaign, initiative and interaction that we deploy to bring about positive change. The paradigm is expressed at the meta-narrative level, where the purpose, the intention, the theory of change is expressed in everything we do. Every initiative, article, story, campaign action are all underpinned by this one-sided paradigm that fails to resonate with the deep psyche. The result? Nothing really changes, despite our best efforts to effect change. This is why we need the skills of a master storyteller, someone who can spot these glaring oversights around human motivation, and can see and work with what lies below the surface of our attention. I'm not sure how we can bring about the necessary and urgent changes needed to address the world's most complex problems without really being able to make changes at this lower level, the meta-narrative level. Otherwise, we will forever remain stuck in a depressing loop of taking one step forward and two steps back. To move forward in a significant way on some of the world's most complex problems, we must be willing to look under the bonnet, so to speak, and to look at the engine that is driving all of these problems. Only when we make sense of the nature of this engine can we start to do something profoundly important, to take apart and build a new engine in which to drive positive change on the issues that we care about. Until we get to the source, we will keep going round and round in circles, wondering why things aren't really changing on some of the most dangerous and threatening issues we all face. So when it comes to big issues such as climate change, global poverty and environmental destruction, without working with meta-narratives and the stories that we tell ourselves, we will forever remain in that dreaded space of knowing what we should do and how to do it, and yet lacking the motivation to do it. Something is out of alignment. Until we fix this, until we realign everything at the meta-narrative level, can we ever hope to create the psychological conditions for real change in our world? There are many terms for our current crisis. One is called the polycrisis, which is a belief that many of the crises we see today, both social and environmental, are inextricably linked. While this is true, the term polycrisis tends to overlook the third and most important aspect here, which is the third position that is driving all of this. There have been many attempts to articulate it, and some see this as a behavioural crisis, or the human crisis, or the psychological crisis, the relational crisis, or even the spiritual crisis. The thing here that drives both is what we are interested in. A polycrisis, because it overlooks this third attractor, tends to seek external solutions to the global problems we see today, rather than doing any significant interior reflection on the relational aspects that give rise to these problems. This is why a preferred term is the meta-crisis, which recognises human interiority and relationality as part of the underlying driver for today's problems. When we work through this lens, instead of trying to fix symptoms, we instead seek to understand what are the psychological conditions that give rise to all these complex and interconnected crises. Instead, we look at the crisis through a relational lens to see what is going on beneath the surface. This thinking is extremely helpful in helping us to understand something very complex is happening beneath the surface of our attention. This approach can help us to focus more on the psychological drivers that sit behind the meta-crisis, and in so doing explore some new ideas, or how to think differently about approaching the problems we face. So let's take a different starting point. Rather than trying to find answers to the questions we ask, where we tend to focus on the externals, like how do we get audiences to take action on climate change, or how do we create policy change, or even how do we get world leaders to make better decisions for our planet and for people, let's find better questions to ask. And these better questions can be, what are the psychological drivers that sit behind our collective problems? And why is it so difficult to create the necessary psychological shift to positive change? Why is it so difficult to create the motivation for meaningful change on issues that people say that they care about? From my experience, having worked for many years on the front line of trying to engage and motivate audiences into positive action, the question always comes down to motivation. Until we get motivation right, nothing really changes. We can create some deep insights and list all the complex problems we face today, we can talk about different solutions, but if we don't crack the motivation question, we always revert back to the beginning, knowing what we ought to do and should do, but lacking the power or motivation to do it. Motivation is not a simple topic. It goes way beyond our usual thinking of how to motivate ourselves to go to the gym or to do something that we prefer not to do. When we expand motivation to include everything that we do, why we act in certain ways, and how our motivation type shapes the lives we lead, we can see how important motivation is in terms of how we relate and how we create positive long-term behavioural change on the issues we face. Motivation is more than creating psychological tricks or positive thinking for us to stick to our diets. For example, we experience the strange paradox of human motivation when we look at big issues such as climate change, where we all say we care about the environment, we care about the well-being of future generations, we care about avoiding the worst effects of climate change. None of us seem to want climate change. We all value these things, and yet our behaviours, what we do, is not in alignment with what we value. So why would this be? Surely logic would dictate that what we value drives our motivation. We don't destroy what we value, and yet we do. And we continue to do, despite the many calls to change track. There is something amiss here, the result of this dreaded thin yes, where we say we believe in the cause but fail to do anything meaningful about it. Whatever is going wrong, it seems to be going wrong below the surface. And I don't think we can simply say that our collective lack of meaningful action on some of the most dangerous issues we face today, and our failure to change course despite our full knowledge of where we are heading, can simply be put down to human vices like greed, laziness, or apathy, as if our indifference to our current situation is a result of a faulty human nature. If human nature or human vices were the problem, then we would see the same patterns of behaviour across all cultures, including indigenous cultures exhibiting the same consumeristic, materialistic behaviours as we do. Of course, they don't. They tend to live in harmony with their natural surroundings and tend not to overreach, even though they have the means to. There is something very interesting going on underneath the surface, one that we are simply not seeing. Trying to understand what is happening here at the motivational level can give us some very useful insights on how we think differently about approaching these serious problems we all face. So how can a master storytelling perspective help us in any way here to understand the motivation paradox? What possible insight can a master storytelling perspective offer in helping us to overcome some of the most complex problems we face today? Well, the answer lies in our ability to understand the deep nature of the whole person, not just the exterior and explicit part of ourselves, but also the interior and implicit nature of how we live, communicate and relate to each other. In other words, what happens below the level of our attention and our so-called conscious mind. This means taking a deep dive and looking at the problems through a relational lens and exploring the role of what happens at the implicit level of everything we do, or the meta-narratives we tell ourselves. So what exactly are meta-narratives and what are their nature? And more importantly, how do they work? To understand them, it's best to explore these in the context of stories, storytelling and literature. Meta-narratives provide the ultimate meaning of the stories we tell. We find the meta-narrative in the gaps, the spaces between, for they are always implied, inferred, pointed to, but are never revealed or made explicit. To make them explicit, they lose power. Their power resides at the pre-conscious level, not conscious. It is only by understanding meta-narratives can we begin to interpret and understand the real meaning of the stories we tell. For example, The Matrix isn't just a story about being stuck in a virtual reality world, fighting the bad guys, but rather is a deeply symbolic story which asks deeper questions about who we are, how do we know what is real, and how Neo, the hero, had to awaken to a deeper purpose which created the psychological conditions for him to carry out a self-sacrificial act. The result of which is that he was able to overcome disorder and create a new order to bring about redemption. This is a classic hero's journey meta-narrative that sits at the heart of this story, giving it so much power. This is the deeper story, the understory within the story. While we can argue that this is what the story is ultimately about, and we can have a rich discussion about whether we agree with this or not, the fact that all this happens implicitly and the meta-narrative is that we engage with this understory without even knowing or realising it. It is why the story resonates with us, because it has a deeper meaning, a deeper meta-narrative driving the whole storyline. Meta-narratives are rarely noticed, and yet they are essential to creating the magic of storytelling, which is resonance. When a story resonates with us, it is usually because of what lies beneath, not what is on the surface. The nature of meta-narratives is very interesting. Meta-narratives fall into this very strange space between the storyteller and the audience. Meta-narratives are not narrated by the storyteller. They may be inferred by the storyteller, but it is the audience who narrates the meta-narrative. The storyteller narrates the story through explicit narrative, the audience narrates the meta-narrative, which is implied by the storyteller. This is the dynamic nature of storytelling. Stories are never data dumps. You do not receive stories. They are not a one-way process where the storyteller gives you the information and we receive it. For a story to come alive, we participate in the storytelling process. If someone is telling us a story, it is up to our imagination to co-create that story. If the storyteller is a good storyteller, they will make you work for the story, creating more room for you to bring yourself into the story. A good storyteller always shows, never tells. That is where storytelling has its power. A great writer would never write, "She felt anxious. She was worried about how she would tell him what she really felt." This language is descriptive. It tells you what the person is feeling without you having to feel it. It is a form of explicit narration. Instead, a good storyteller would write, "Her hands trembled, and her heart raced as she stared into his eyes. The words of what she wanted to say stuck at the back of her throat. She swallowed hard. Her eyes watered as she cautiously began to speak." When we explain or tell the reader the feelings of the character, when we make the emotion explicit, the reader is not brought into the story. It is as if we are the storyteller and the reader are both outside observers looking in, and in so doing we make the story feel devitalized, flat, dull, and unengaging. This type of attention makes stories feel more like a report rather than a story. And as a side note, which I won't get into here, there are many communications across the charity sector that do exactly this, where the stories we tell of those living in poverty or those affected by climate change follow this pattern of the outside observer looking in on the story. What passes for storytelling feels more like a report. But what is implied is where the magic of storytelling happens. The implicit narrative helps to engage the audience, giving the story huge power. Because now we are bringing the audience into the experience of what anxiety is. It is up to the audience to narrate for themselves that the character is feeling anxious. And here is the remarkable thing. We never bring this feeling of anxiety or the words anxiety into our conscious thoughts. We just know it, not from an intellectual or rationalizing perspective, but from an embodied and experiential perspective. While we might all feel what the storyteller is communicating, we might not all be able to articulate it as such. This is why implicit narratives and meta-narratives take on a universal dimension. They are, when done correctly, open to everyone regardless of age, educational background, experiences and culture. We can even allow the storyteller to bring us into some of the darkest and scariest situations, causing us to feel real fear. Our hearts will even start accelerating when the light in the dark basements starts to flicker and cut out. Or we can even feel real empathy and even a deep sadness in stories, even though we know them to be fictional and not real. And this is the crazy thing, rather than being angry at the storyteller for manipulating our feelings, we are grateful for this. We don't hate them for making us feel scared or to feel sad. We enjoy the story more as a result. Because we all do this, we don't notice how peculiar this is. The storyteller infers and implies it is up to the audience to bring themselves to the story. This is a true beauty of storytelling, and how good storytelling can grip us, can work with us at the cerebral, emotional and pre-conscious level, all at the same time without us realising it. We don't passively receive stories, we actively generate them. Stories are co-created, and in that co-creation there is space for us to be transformed by them, and shaped by the values they present to us. This also helps to make sense of the preference of reading a story through the black and white letters typed on a page over watching a multi-million-pound movie production. Storytelling that fires up our imagination and creates a space for us to co-create the narrative, this type of storytelling becomes an encounter between the storyteller and the audience. If we were to take all this away, where we no longer need to imagine or co-create the story, the result is that we become more passive and the story has a lesser impact on us. We might not embody the values or the emotional experiences that the story instilled on us. This helps to reveal some important insights around all forms of communication, including campaigning, including marketing, including policy writing, pretty much everything that we do. Both the story and the understory, the narrative and the metanarrative, both run consecutively together. There is never not a metanarrative. But like fish in water, we can't see metanarratives, only through them. As metanarratives arise from within ourselves, we mistake their thinking for our own. Let's turn our attention to the two different flow states that take in place here. Narratives are externally regulated, they come from the storyteller, they are explicit. So the flow state is external, the flow from outside to in. Metanarratives have a different flow state, they are self-regulated. They flow from the self and they move out. And these flow states are important, as we will soon see. Metanarratives are implicit by nature. They form an essential component for all forms of communication. They can present us with values which we may, in the light of day, fundamentally disagree with, but we will adopt their logic and values when they remain in an implicit state. When metanarratives are made explicit, they lose their power, and we don't take them seriously at all. Their power is when they are communicated implicitly. That's when they have the power to shape our values and behaviours without us even being aware of their influence. Narrative and metanarrative run comfortably alongside each other. So how is it possible for us to pay attention to both the narrative, the explicit aspect of the story, and the metanarrative, the implicit aspect of the story at the same time? It's hard enough to concentrate on one thing at a time, so how is it possible to concentrate on both concurrently? And why do we only seem to notice narratives, and we don't seem to notice metanarratives? And how can something that is implicit play such a pivotal role in shaping our values and how we relate to the world around us? The answer to that question comes down to how we think. Building on the brilliant work and insights of Ian McGilchrist and his theory on the two hemispheres of the brain, we can get into some groundbreaking and helpful insights taken from neuropsychology on the nature of thinking and how the two hemispheres of the brain work. The psychologist and philosopher Ian McGilchrist in his writings explores the nature of the two hemispheres. He competently debunks the popular myth of the two hemispheres, where one does analysis and the other one does creativity. But rather, he shows that they don't do different things, but that they do the same things differently. They both do analysis, they both do creativity, but they both attend to the same thing in different ways. The left hemisphere is narrow attention, goal-orientated, categorizes, literal, self-absorbed and dogmatic. It is this hemisphere that deals with the explicit. In our context, the explicit narrative of a story made up of all the externals, narrative, characters, visuals and so on. And the right hemisphere is broad attention, vigilant, understands context, empathizes, is relational, self-aware. This hemisphere deals with the implicit, or rather the meta-narrative. Both hemispheres have different value systems, and both hemispheres have completely different dispositions to understanding the world around us. They are always working together. Both hemispheres are always understanding and interpreting the world in accordance to their own worldviews, own logic, and together they help us make sense of the world around us. We can also think of these two hemispheres in a constant tug of war, a power imbalance between the two, where one is dominant over the other. So why should this matter? Does it make any difference as to which hemisphere we place more emphasis on? Well, the answer to that is a clear yes. The two hemispheres both have different value systems. They both have different ways of attending to the world, and the result of this shift between a dominant left hemisphere and a dominant right has profound implications for our world today, and the problems that we see. Our culture clearly prefers the left hemisphere's take of the world. The left is the master. The left is good at manipulation, at computational thinking, categorization and compartmentalization. Great at process thinking, the type of thinking which is more like a computer, and prefers technological solutions to the problems we face. But the left hemisphere, according to Ian, makes a terrible master. It has a poor grasp on reality, as it creates its own reality, a representation of what is real, and mistakes the maps and models it creates for reality itself. The left hemisphere lacks any understanding of context, meaning, and the bigger picture, and struggles to understand the relationship between things, preferring to see everything as isolated and independent. In his work, Ian evidences all of this with patients who have had a stroke, showing those who lose a function of the left hemisphere will lose their speech, but they can still make sense of the world. Those who lose their right hemisphere functions might retain speech, but they struggle to make sense of the world around them, the feelings, the depth, and how everything relates. They even lose the ability to understand humour, metaphors, as well as body language and social cues. McGilchrist suggests that it is the right hemisphere that holds the bigger picture, is more wise and discerning. It does not seek manipulation, but apprehension, an understanding of the world. It is not destructive in nature. It is the hemisphere that we should restore as master, which is a much healthier relationship. But our culture, which prefers to manipulate, prefers power, prefers the values the left hemisphere presents to us, we see the left hemisphere as the dominant one. This is expressed in a hierarchy of attention, where a healthy balance between the two is where the left hemisphere's role is that of a servant rather than master. The left hemisphere clearly plays a very important role, just as long as it doesn't try to take over. The right sees the whole picture, takes the raw information and presents it to the left hemisphere. The left deals with this represented reality. To make sense of reality, the left hemisphere creates maps and models and puts all information into neat compartments in order to understand this information, and create an order to make sense of everything. In other words, it creates an inner story to make sense of what is, often mistaking this inner story for reality. Now, a healthy thinking process will then return all this to the right hemisphere to see if this compartmentalization of information makes sense. Rather than the left hemisphere having the final say, it makes more sense to allow the right to have the final say and to use this hemisphere as a master. But this is where we seem to be going wrong in our culture. This last part, a return to the big picture, the wiser hemisphere, fails to emerge. Instead, we take only the left hemisphere's take on the world seriously, neglecting the view of the right. The result is that this shift towards a dominant left hemisphere perspective may offer us intelligence, the ability to rationalize, to dissect and compartmentalize information, offering us power to manipulate the world around us. But the result is that we become more dogmatic, less wise. We are unable to see beyond the thinking capacity of the left hemisphere logic. We mistake the reality it presents as reality. We cannot, from a dominant left hemisphere perspective, see or understand paradigms, and we have no way of seeing metanarratives, or the implicit narratives that are found in every communication, every encounter, every disclosure we have when we communicate with someone. Language is held in the left hemisphere. We rationalize and calculate with the left hemisphere. The result is that the left hemisphere thinks that it is the only hemisphere that exists. It thinks that it is the originator of thinking. It believes its thinking is autonomous, while never really understanding that it plays a secondary role in the hierarchy of thinking. It is the right hemisphere which does the primary thinking and represents this thinking to the left. This gives us some essential insight into how metanarratives play an essential role in how we think about everything. What is implied in everything we do is relayed silently to the rationalizing left hemisphere. This process is happening every second of our lives, and yet we remain blind or ignorant of this fact, and to the metanarratives that shape our lives. The left hemisphere takes its way of thinking far too seriously. It believes it can make universal statements that apply to all people, all time, and all cultures. It does not know what it does not know, and thinks it knows, making it highly dogmatic and arrogant. It believes the stories it tells itself regardless of how outlandish they may be. There is so much more to unpick here, but just to make the point here that when it comes to story and storytelling, we can now begin to see how metanarratives, the implicit aspects of the stories we tell, are not just a minor part of storytelling, nor are metanarratives dealt with some small part of the brain. Now we can point to a whole hemisphere of the brain actively dedicated to the task of dealing with the implicit messages that surround us every day. So billions of neurons working away all the time to make sense of the whole, the relationship and implicit aspects of everything that is communicated. And this happens alongside the thinking of the left hemisphere. It seems better to say that we have two minds, the rationalizing mind, left hemisphere, and the relational mind, the right hemisphere. So why don't we notice metanarratives? Well, we can if we are open to this way of thinking. But our modern approach to thinking seems to close us off to this part of ourselves, where we seem to distrust anything that doesn't appear to follow the rules of the left hemisphere, our rationalistic thinking. We prefer the left hemisphere's take on the world. If we look at the philosophy of René Descartes' I think, therefore I am, this is a very powerful paradigm. It's called the Cartesian paradigm, that shapes so much of our thinking today, as we believe it to be true. This philosophical proposition makes a clear preference towards the left hemisphere's take on the world, the thinking or rational brain. I think becomes more or less I rationalise, therefore I am. We over-associate ourselves, who I am, with a thinking, rationalising mind. We believe that we are its thoughts. Anything else, including intuition, emotion, contemplative attention, and different types of knowing, are either ignored or treated with great suspicion. The only thing we think we can and should trust is our thinking, rationalising mind. Anything else just gets in the way. All aspects of what makes us human are treated with contempt, while we seem to celebrate all those aspects of ourselves where we think more like a robot or computer. It's quite extraordinary if you think about it. But we are not trapped in the rationalising mind. There are other ways of thinking that are open to us. For example, the contemplative mind, the mind that can sit with something and apprehend its true meaning. It's a different mode of attention. It is a mindset that can see what lies in between, what's implied, the power dynamics, the values flow, and a whole range of different aspects. But seldom do we use the contemplative mindset nor see its value. We seem to prefer the rationalising mind. We prefer the power it offers us, and the clarity it gives us, and the simple story that it tells us to make sense of the world around us. This shift towards a dominant left hemisphere view of the world may give us power but not understanding, the ability to manipulate but also the loss of wisdom and meaning. We no longer seem to value wisdom. In wisdom cultures and wisdom traditions, this contemplative mindset is clearly valued, so is the value of wisdom. In Native American tribes and in many indigenous cultures, the leader tended to be a wisdom leader who would often use storytelling to help regulate the tribe. This was a form of storytelling which helped to awaken the necessary values needed for the tribe to survive. It seems that we no longer know how to do this. We no longer know how to motivate from within, how to create meaning systems, how to work with inner purpose, and all the other aspects of the self that are needed for our higher values to emerge. We have lost something that we once had, and that is the art of master storytelling. It seems that we are trapped in a Cartesian paradigm, a way of thinking that overemphasizes the rationalizing mind that can only deal with the explicit and can no longer see the implicit. The result of this has huge implications for understanding the psychological drivers that sit behind the meta-crisis. From an over-rationalizing mindset, not only do we struggle to see the implicit, we tend to totally overlook the dominant meta-narratives that shape every aspect of our work. We only see the explicit. So therefore, as logic would dictate, well, left hemisphere logic anyway, we think that the solutions to the meta-crisis have to do with externals, with what is explicit, with things. We look to science to provide technical solutions to the problems we face without exploring the broken relationships with the world around us. We try to think of ways to manipulate audiences into taking positive action, which we call marketing, without really considering how can we motivate from within and how do we awaken the necessary values needed for positive change. The result is that the motivation for real change never really emerges within our current framework of thinking. We therefore can't think of solutions that fall outside this mode of attention. Like, we know it's important to work with values, but when we make them explicit, we treat them as things, without understanding the different flow states of values in a conscious and pre-conscious state. We don't seem to understand motivation and confuse intrinsic motivation with positive thinking, which it isn't. And we really struggle to understand how to work with the universal aspects of purpose. Instead, we try to show outcomes and deliverables, causes and consequences as a form of motivation for positive action. Within this thinking framework, it is no wonder nothing new really emerges, and we seem to go round and round in circles. The end result is that we no longer see what is everywhere, in everything that we do, and which we participate in its flow. We can't see metanarratives or the implicit, nor values in the flow state, nor the dynamic nature of purpose. We no longer see the clear link between the meta-crisis and the toxic metanarratives that shapes everything that we do. The results of this have huge implications for the future of our world and how we will ever be able to address some of the greatest issues we face today. Meta-narratives reflect the paradigms we hold to be true, and the values ecology of that paradigm shapes our values. It is not that anyone values destroying nature or values extreme poverty. That's not the point. Nor, and this is a controversial statement here, that these things only occur because we value something more, where we value our own wealth, our own comfort and security over that of others. It clearly goes deeper than that, beyond a belief that the meta-crisis is due to our collective overindulgence on our own vices of greed and avarice. We value what we believe to be true, and what we believe to be true simply reflects the belief systems of the paradigms that we hold. If you're getting confused here, then join the club, because this is circular logic. This is a paradigm trap. The paradigms that shape our thinking are the same paradigms we try to use to find solutions to the problems we face. If we can't spot paradigms nor question the logic of the paradigms we hold, we will always revert to their value system, not our own. The same mindset that caused the problem in the first place cannot be the same mindset that solves it. That makes no sense. We cannot think our way out of a paradigm trap, nor rationalize our way out of it. Instead, we need to find ways of escaping the paradigm trap, where we first recognize the trap and we hold on to the belief that just as we got ourselves into the trap, we can get ourselves out, and create a new paradigm in which to live by. One that doesn't cause so much harm to ourselves and the world around us. Part of the journey towards becoming a master storyteller is understanding motivation. So to help us see better, let us create a new motivational model that helps us to escape the paradigm trap. Let us build a model using the insights from Ian McGilchrist's research and theory. Remember the two hemispheres and the two flow states? The left hemisphere is narrow attention. It breaks everything down. The flow state is usually from out to in. It is extrinsic in nature. The right hemisphere is broad attention. Its flow state starts from within and flows out. It is intrinsic in nature. We use both hemispheres to do everything, but there is always a power imbalance between the two. So let's draw a continuum. This line represents us, and split this into 8 sections. The first 2 flow states are the extremes, a totally dominant left hemisphere attention, marked by the blue arrow, and on the right a totally dominant right hemisphere attention. Then we can start to populate the different stages of the continuum with gradually declining influence of the left hemisphere over the right. This creates a very, very powerful model in helping us to understand and unpick what is going on here. When we compare this model to other current motivational models, especially self-determination theory, we can see something interesting straight away. In self-determination theory, it models the left hemisphere attributes almost perfectly. But when it comes onto the right hemisphere, something strange happens. It seems to conflate all the right hemisphere attributes together into one category. In other words, our understanding of extrinsic motivation, the type of motivation where we seek external rewards or avoid punishment to drive our behavior, we have a detailed grasp of this motivation type, and we use it all the time in everything that we do. But when we move to the right-hand side, our understanding of intrinsic motivation is woefully inadequate. We have 3 whole categories missing altogether for a start. But this is the side of the continuum that is the most interesting. This is the side that deals with intrinsic motivation, where we do something not for any external reward or to avoid fear and anxiety, but we do something because it rises from within. It draws from within and moves out towards a greater purpose, a purpose that transcends the needs of the fearful and anxious ego. This is a flow state that we're interested in. It is on this side that we can create long-term behavior change. It's on this side where we can work with intrinsic values such as protecting the environment, peace, and social justice. All these values are self-transcendent values. They follow the same flow state, starting from within and moving out beyond the self. But working on this side of the continuum not only requires a different language, it also has a different values ecology. The rules of engagement are completely different to the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, to drive motivation, we play to lower values of greed, insecurity, or fear. And on the right, well, we have to deal with the language of purpose, meaning, connection, relationality. In other words, all the things that make up the spiritual aspect of the self. These are the interior aspects that not only do we struggle with, but we no longer understand from a dominant left hemisphere culture. And the result is, well, we remain trapped in the lower stages of the motivation continuum, unable to cross the threshold onto the right-hand side. A recent review of climate communications, to illustrate this point, mapped to this continuum shows a clear shift towards the lower stages of the motivation continuum. This makes no sense. Protecting the environment is an intrinsic value. We therefore should be running our campaigns, our initiatives, our communications, our actions that all draw from the higher stages of the motivation continuum on the right. But we don't, despite the logic of trying to extrinsically motivate intrinsic values. You can't extrinsically motivate an intrinsic value. To do so changes the nature of the value itself, and it no longer has a power to transform. It seems that this mapping exercise has shown us something very important here, something that is happening below the surface of our attention. We are clearly trapped in a paradigm, and if we want to bring about a meaningful change on some of the biggest issues we face today, then understanding what this paradigm is and how to escape it is our urgent task. The The marketing paradigm is one of the most insidious and dangerous paradigms that exists today, and yet we seem to embrace its logic and apply it to everything that we do. This paradigm is based on a pattern of thinking that seeks to create dissonance within your audiences in order for them to buy your product or service. It follows the classic marketing formula: create the need and then show how your product is a magic solution. This paradigm works best when it creates dissonance, anxiety, fear, or plays to our lower values. And when we do this, we engage and awaken all the values that bring harm to our world, which has real-world negative effects. If we create fear and anxiety, or a sense that whatever we have is not enough, then we can drive sales. It's a perfect engine to drive profit. It's a perfect engine to drive our capital-centric economic systems, but this is a psychological pollutant. The harm it creates to ourselves, the global family, and to the natural world can never be ignored or overlooked. It is like a fossil-fueled engine. We use it because it works, but it works at a cost. This engine is a dangerous engine because it is a psychological pollutant. Playing to our deepest fears, creating anxieties, playing to our insecurities is a preferred tactic of the marketing paradigm. It works best when it engages our lower values. As a result, we not only allow the marketing paradigm to manipulate and shape the very values that we aspire to hold, but we also adopt the logic and values of this paradigm. Just as we have air pollution and noise pollution, we also have values pollution. The values that cause harm to our world and to the human family emerge as a condition for this motivational engine to work. It's the nature of the marketing paradigm to play to our lower values, and it works best when it does. The marketing paradigm is based on the manipulative mindset, how to manipulate audiences to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do, to buy something that they otherwise don't really need. It is a paradigm because it shapes how we think and how we relate to reality. We think that the only way to motivate audiences to do something is to play to our lower values. The circular logic here is that this omnipresent paradigm that makes up the background noise of everything we do, we absorb its values and we believe that the only way to motivate someone is to play to their lower values and offer a magic solution that will make everything right again. And in so doing, the marketing paradigm perpetuates a foundational belief that we adopt into our deep psyche, that we can avoid suffering. Marketing works best by creating the path of least resistance, making it easier for us to be a better version of ourselves. Rather than doing any inner work or awakening to this better version, which we could all be, we can buy a product that will do it all for us. There is something out there that will make you look better, will help you gain respect, will give you power, pleasure, or make your life easier and better as a result of buying this one thing. This is a constant promise of the magic solution offered by the marketing paradigm. Because this is a paradigm, this shift in attention changes how we think and relate to the world around us. We create a convenience culture to avoid suffering, or to take the path of least resistance, in the belief that our lives will be slightly better or enriched. But our convenience culture, our attempts to avoid suffering, now chokes our seas with throwaway plastic, causing harm not only to marine life, but will be a huge problem for future generations. We poison our seas, our air, our soil, not because we want to avoid suffering. But suffering cannot be avoided, and our attempts to do so only transports it elsewhere. Our desire for cheaper goods and services transpires as poverty wages further down the supply chain. This is not a conscious decision, but a response to the need to avoid suffering, or rather to avoid anxiety. And this is a marketing paradigm trap. Traditional marketing models creates the anxiety in the first place, and our behaviours are shaped by the need to overcome that anxiety. So when we observe human behaviour through this paradigm, we can conclude that we are selfish and greedy by nature. But this is a conditioned state, not our natural state. Our natural state looks very different. It's not competitive, but cooperative. Not greedy, but we are capable of acts of incredible selfless generosity. The very things that make us human are being eroded and degraded in the marketing paradigm. We don't seem to think through the implications of using this engine for everything we do. It is an expression of the left hemisphere's take on the world, and is made up of three components that work together to create a powerful motivational engine to drive sales, to drive audience engagement, or to drive everything that we do. These three components are extrinsic values. This engine works best when it plays to extrinsic values such as power, security, and how we are perceived by others. It becomes weaker when we try to work with intrinsic values such as peace, social justice, and protected environments. Extrinsic motivation. This engine only knows how to work with extrinsic motivation. It will create fear or play to our greed to drive motivation, and it will find a million creative ways to manipulate audiences into buying a product or service. And extrinsic purpose. This is always about short-term outcomes, about making a sale without the bigger consideration of what values and motivational triggers you use to make the sale. Interiority is of no concern in the marketing paradigm. It is happy to keep audiences immature and needy. That way you create the psychological conditions for them to remain trapped in their lower consumeristic values. These three components work in perfect harmony, and we are so used to the values and tactics of the marketing paradigm, as it makes up the background noise of our everyday life, we no longer see these as a negative thing. In fact, quite the opposite. We see that marketing is good. We see the stories it tells us as something positive. We are relieved to believe that we can avoid suffering and will buy into every magic solution that is on offer. We slowly absorb the values ecology of the marketing paradigm over time, and we even use the same techniques and the logic of the marketing paradigm to drive our climate campaigns, our social justice initiatives, and our work towards creating meaningful change. This makes absolutely no sense. It's equivalent of creating a fossil-fueled carbon capture plant. Any supposed gains we get in getting people to sign up to our campaigns are offset by the values of the marketing methodologies to drive the motivation. The irony is that we use eco-anxiety, show how bad the world is and how worse it is getting, and show the magic solution of sign up to our campaign to make a difference. Show the need and offer the magic solution. Classic marketing. If we create eco-anxiety on the way, it doesn't really matter. The end justifies the means. But it does matter. Eco-anxiety is an inhibitor for authentic change and motivation. Anxiety is a feeling of powerlessness. Using the marketing engine to drive positive change in the world not only will not work, it will undermine the cause altogether. The marketing paradigm is designed for profit, not behaviour change. So we now have the irony of climate campaigners who are passionately against the negative effects and values of marketing consumerism, using exactly the same marketing engine to drive their campaigns for social change. It might seem an obvious contradiction now that's been pointed out, but the reason that we seem to be using this engine, so to speak, is not because we want to, it's because we don't know how to use the other engine. And when we try, we can't quite get it to work. When we move to the right-hand side of the motivational continuum, we work with self-regulated values and motivational triggers. Remember the flow states, they start from within and they move out. So the obvious hurdle that we must overcome is, how do you intrinsically motivate someone? Extrinsic motivation is pretty much easy. You just create fear or anxiety and then offer a way of overcoming that fear or anxiety. Pretty much simple marketing logic. But with intrinsic motivation, you can't make someone love or care for our planet. You can tell them that they should or ought to, or give 1,000 reasons why caring for the environment is important. We can even play to the values they hold, or we can even use guilt. But we're back to extrinsic motivation. Do you see how hard this is at first? How do we intrinsically motivate people to care for our planet, to work for justice, to live a simpler and more meaningful life? How do we create the political will for real change using intrinsic motivation? The mistake most people make is to go for positive thinking, positive stories, or a positive mentality. If only we can show how taking action feels good, how our lives will be better if we work towards creating a better world. Then people will be inspired and the behaviour will follow. But this thinking is highly problematic. Positive thinking is short-term, usually towards a single goal. It requires a high external regulation to make it work, and it's still a form of extrinsic motivation. If we think of all the marketing adverts we have seen throughout our lives play into our inner fears and desires, they all look positive. They are inviting, they're filled with positive imagery, and yet the marketing paradigm sits on the left-hand side of the motivation continuum. Positive thinking, inspirational stories, trying to move from doom and gloom messages to feel-good, inspiring messaging may seem to be the answer here to human motivation, but it still keeps us locked in the lower stages of the motivation continuum. Knowing how to work with intrinsic motivation can have a significant and profound effect on everything that we do. The answer to this question on motivation can help unlock the door to working in a way in which we can create real and meaningful change on some of the most complex issues we face. Because if we knew how to use a different engine, this would be the game changer. Because this is a motivational engine, we can apply it to everything that we do. Every campaign, every initiative, every aspect of our work can draw from this engine. The promise here is that using this engine, this new paradigm, we get to work with the aspects of motivation that leads to long-term behavior change. We work with the aspect of motivational and happier life. The nature of this engine is completely different from the marketing paradigm. The rules of engagement are different, the language is different, and how we engage the values is very different. This engine works with intrinsic motivation, a type of motivation that draws from within and is self-regulated. It is not drawn by guilt, fear, or anxiety, but by self-transcendent dynamics. Intrinsic values, the necessary values we need to work to bring about positive change, especially social justice, protecting the environment and peace. An intrinsic purpose, a type of purpose that does not seek an outcome or external validation, but rather is more aligned to an interior awakening. The same universal pattern that we find in almost all wisdom traditions and wisdom cultures. The emphasis on wisdom over intelligence, enlightenment over consumerism. Well, the marketing paradigm is based on the foundational belief that we can be happier if we avoid suffering, which only transmits suffering elsewhere, causing real-world harm to our world. The storytelling paradigm has a different foundational belief. Transcend suffering. Suffering cannot be avoided, nor is suffering good, but it is necessary, and in our overcoming of it, we are transformed. That's the underlying philosophy in a nutshell. To transform to our higher values, we include suffering, and we transcend it. Transcend and include is the pattern here. This is what our great ancestors knew when they gathered around a fire telling stories. Not stories to pass on survival tips or information, as is often believed, but stories that help the tribe to understand and make sense of suffering. The common term for this is mythology. Myths make sense of and show how we transcend suffering. But when we look at the great myths of old, stories based on the hero's journey, sacred storytelling, they do something very different with suffering. They all show that suffering is necessary, the hero has to fall, be defeated in some way, struggle, in order to awaken to a better version of himself. This pattern of fall, struggle and awakening also happens to be the necessary psychological conditions needed to awaken intrinsic values, the very values needed to bring about real change. Intrinsic values remain dormant, passive and aspirational until they've undergone some sort of suffering. For example, values such as forgiveness have no real power, only until they are tested, until we are thrown into a situation where we can no longer rely on our usual tactics, where we use our usual cerebral tactics of overcoming suffering. Only until we have fallen do we learn how to draw from within, deep within, and in that drawing we are transformed. This is why indigenous cultures still do rites of initiation, where the uninitiated would have to endure some sort of hardship, some sort of suffering, and learn not to run from it, but to transcend it. The result is that these tribes that engage in this practice tend to have very high pro-social and pro-environmental behaviours. They tend to celebrate wisdom thinking and wisdom leaders. The result is that they can live within their means. They see the earth and each other as sacred. They celebrate the lives of their ancestors and they see how their lives meaningfully connect to generations yet to come. They tend not to be driven by anxiety values like we are, and they can live a happy and meaningful life, rich with stories and rituals, and yet have, from a consumer point of view, very little. This is something we really struggle with. We have allowed marketers become today's myth makers, who have reversed the sacred myth of suffering and have embraced the false myth that we can avoid suffering. The result is that we remain locked out of the right-hand side of the motivation continuum and stuck in the left. We remain trapped in ways of thinking that fall within the logic of the left hemisphere, which is always trying to find the path of least resistance, trying to make life better, but as a result destroys everything in its wake. We have lost the insights from wisdom cultures that tell a very different story, one that is not about avoidance of suffering, but transcending suffering altogether. That's why in Christianity we usually see the suffering Christ on the cross, not the risen Christ. This single image has extraordinary power that has resonated with millions upon millions of people over the ages. It makes no logical sense. It is like a counter brand, if you will. No branding agency would ever dream of using an image like this. Instead, modern branding tends to reflect the values of the marketing paradigm, to make it feel easier to engage with a company or organisation. Branding tends to show you how to take away suffering, not transcend it. To work with intrinsic motivation means embracing this foundational truth. We don't get people to live out of their higher values or to move to the higher stages of the motivational continuum without showing, psychologically at least, that suffering is necessary and that it can be transcended. This is why we call this the storytelling paradigm, because this reflects the deep nature of stories and storytelling that show and reveal this pattern. It's why some stories resonate with us and others leave us feeling flat. We are drawn to stories that have conflict, have good overcoming evil, where suffering is transcended. If we take away conflict, take away the pattern of a happy ending, then the stories just don't feel right. We react negatively to them, despite the fact that real life doesn't always have a happy ending. Stories don't really reflect reality, but are laying out the patterns of the deep psyche that resonates with the deep self. We are moving towards the knowledge, values and wisdom thinking that resides in the right hemisphere, that resides in every one of us. If we are to create real and meaningful change on some of the biggest issues we face today, knowing how to work with the right hemisphere, how to work with the intrinsic flow pattern in everything that we do, becomes our essential task. In other words, how to work with metanarratives to reverse the flow pattern from out to in, extrinsic to in to out, intrinsic. And it all depends on how we deal with suffering. So why are we so bad at thinking up good solutions? We can only think within the confines and the values frame of the paradigms we hold. This is why current solutions to the problems we face tend not only to be bad ideas, but ideas that always look good but tend to get us nowhere fast. Having worked in this field for most of my adult life, I've listened to some of the greatest thinkers of our age reflecting on different topics around the meta crisis and how we need to respond to it. So when it comes to analysis, understanding the problem, the insights have been incredible, very valuable. But when it comes to the practical solutions, what do we do? How do we do it? The solutions tend to be woefully inadequate to the task of the problems we face. We are clearly trapped in a paradigm here, unable to think a way out of it. Remember, it doesn't matter how well educated you are or intelligent you are, if you cannot recognize the paradigm you're trapped in, you'll never be able to think beyond the values and logic of that paradigm. Let's go through some of these ideas and see why they fall short of where we need to go. So the first is the uncritical model. This is the belief that when it comes to trying to bring about real change on the meta crisis, we're doing everything right. We just need to push harder, shout louder, turn the temperature up, be more articulate, and better explaining the science behind climate change, social inequality, or species loss, or whatever the issue is. This is the 2 aspirants good, 4 aspirants better model. Just because some of this is true, informing, educating, and explaining why we need to take urgent action on some of the problems we face is important and plays a key role, it does not mean doing more of the same will bring about the changes we seek. This is a half-truth, and half-truths are dangerous because we mistake them for the whole truth, putting all of our energy into them thinking that they are the solutions to the problems we face. When we try to fix our global problems at the symptom level, we often do more to maintain the status quo than to address what is happening underneath at the metanarrative level. Next, we have the manipulative model. We find this view taken up especially from scientific journals and literature that the way to positive behavioural change is to find ways to manipulate audiences into doing the right thing. This can include nudges, psychological tricks to show how doing good, like recycling, follows the path of least resistance. So following insights from behavioural psychologists, we create a choice architecture where we make it easier to do positive actions and psychologically harder to do the negative. We make it easier to recycle and harder to throw everything into general waste. We can point to the marginal successes of this strategy and show how it works, and it does work to a point, but it's simply an external solution to an interior problem. People who are awakened to the values of caring for our planet will overcome the path of least resistance and go the extra mile to recycle their rubbish. By ignoring or not working with interior aspects of the self, we tend to keep audiences immature. We might make it easier for them to recycle, but what about all the other aspects of the meta crisis? Following the path of least resistance using external regulation to drive positive behaviour can only take us so far. Again, we are dealing with symptoms and external behaviours, rather than directing our energy to focus on the interior drivers and causes behind the meta crisis. When we don't know how to work with or awaken values, the spillover is that we are just creating another form of external regulation. By following the logic of creating the path of least resistance to behaviour change, we are further embedding the false myth that suffering can be avoided. What may look like a good solution to creating positive behaviour changes tends to undermine the greater cause of awakening audiences to the necessary values needed to bring about meaningful change. It is still a left hemisphere solution. So is a belief around reframing the issues we care about. Rather than talk about climate change, we should reframe it as a health issue, play to people's concerns about their health. Rather than using doom and gloom messages around the climate crisis, we instead talk about health benefits of living a healthy life, which means creating a healthy environment. Again, we're playing to self-enhancement values, which are extrinsic values, how we all benefit from this. This is still extrinsic motivation. Or we reframe how we talk about some of these global issues. We can reframe climate change to accelerated global heating, which can help us to see the problem from a different perspective. Again, this is useful, but reframing the issue we face is just another psychological trick to try to change something that underlies all of this under the surface. Remember, the left hemisphere is a manipulative mindset. It will always seek to use its own logic to find solutions to the problems we face. The left hemisphere will break everything down, as we do in science and psychology, and find something, a thing, that it can use as a form of power or manipulation. In psychology, this may be an insight into heuristic biases, or how to use psychological nudges to drive positive behaviour. While some of these may work in the short term, it doesn't get us to the heart of the problems we face. The next one is the limits of science. There are broadly 2 fields of thinking to draw from when we try to find solutions to the big problems we face: the sciences and the humanities. It is strange from my experience that we seem to draw all of our insight into finding solutions to the meta-crisis from the sciences, while overlooking the humanities almost altogether. This is a reflection on the paradigms we hold, our preference for left hemisphere thinking. Somehow we believe that the boffins in white coats will find the solutions to the problems we face, that there is a magic bullet somewhere that will solve all of our problems. While technological progress is obviously something very useful, it is the thinking that underlies this perspective that is clearly problematic. To give a concrete example, in a recent paper by world scientists called The Behavioural Crisis Driving Ecological Overshoot, this is a very well researched and considered paper that draws attention to the behavioural crisis that's driving the overshoots of most of Earth's ecological boundaries. The research is excellent, the arguments are well formulated, on the research and analysis side it's hard to fault it in any way. It even highlights the negative effects of marketing. Great. what's not to fault. But when it comes to solutions, this is where we get into some pretty predictable and bad ideas. One of the solutions the researchers suggest is that to solve the meta crisis, we need to turn to, now I'm not making this up, marketers. After all, they are the experts at reframing, according to this report. They even give an example of positive reframing where advertising a yogurt as 98% fat-free is much more compelling than promoting the same product as containing only 2% milk fat. The idea that if we can draw upon the insights from marketing to reframe solutions in a positive light, then we can bring about positive change. Not only does this approach not even touch the size of the problems we face, but there seems to be a lack of understanding, even according to its own logic, that marketing methodologies are part of the problem, not the solution. Using a reframing technique and creating the path of least resistance, as in this example, is using the same mindset that sits underneath the meta crisis, the tricks to show how we can avoid suffering. This supposed solution is not just an oversight on the paper's behalf, this is clearly showing just how trapped we are in the marketing paradigm, where we not only struggle to see beyond its own logic, we turn to it as a solution to the problems we face. And to top it all off, the paper in its final recommendations calls for increased interdisciplinary collaboration between the social and behavioural science theorists and practitioners. Again, drawing from the sciences, with no mention of interdisciplinary collaboration with the humanities. Within the technocratic paradigm, there seems to be a lack of ability to see beyond the limits of science. An appropriate conclusion of the paper should have been, as scientists, we don't know how to do this. We need help from different thinkers across all disciplines, not just the sciences. Scientific approaches are not geared towards working with intrinsic motivation, intrinsic purpose, all these aspects of what is generally referred to as spiritual aspects of the self. Within this paradigm, we will never understand metanarratives, the role of myths, sacred storytelling, and all these aspects that resonate and work with the right hemisphere. While there are always exceptions to the norm, generally speaking, traditional scientific modes of thinking and analysis can never really lead to the deep solutions to the meta crisis. It is not within the nature of their thinking to do so. Tell stories from the paradigms we are trapped in. Only until we change the paradigm with a meta-narrative, the ultimate meaning of the stories we tell will change. This is a reflection of so many well-intentioned attempts to use storytelling for positive change. Now, as you can imagine, I'm a huge advocate of the role of storytelling and how changing the story can help us bring about real changes to the problems we face. But most storytelling projects fall into the first trap. They reflect the paradigms that we hold. This includes lots of storytelling projects that believe if we tell positive stories, if we inspire people, then they will take positive action on some of the big issues we face, especially climate change. But we're back to a false belief in terms of human motivation. First is a belief that positive thinking, positive stories, all fall into the right-hand side of the motivation continuum. And the second is that what people lack is a sense of that they are part of something bigger, something positive. Change will happen if we can all work together, filled with positive images of people being happy and stories of young people taking the lead that can inspire others. What's not to like about this? And I don't want to be the one that pours cold water on what is seemingly some good initiatives to inspire positive change, but we do have to keep coming back to the deep psychological drivers behind the meta crisis. These stories tend to show how taking positive action is fun, enjoyable, and will be rewarded by taking part in. They are drawn from the same extrinsic engine, the marketing paradigm engine that we're so familiar with. If we look at wisdom traditions and ancient cultures, the stories they told look a world apart from the stories that we think we should tell. We tend to think through the paradigm we hold that positive thinking will bring about positive change. Positive stories will create the motivation for real change. This makes no sense when we map these to the values and motivational maps we have at our disposal. In a paper by Jessica Nosk-Turner on communications for development and social change, she points out that most of the communications for positive change tend to emphasize optimism, creativity, boldness, and change-making as essential components. She highlights how all of these reflect the values of neoliberalism, which draws from capitalistic cultures and entrepreneurialism, the very values that drive the problems we are seeking to overcome. This is a problem with values blindness. Sometimes we put our energy behind what seems to be a good initiative without really understanding the value dynamics underlying these seemingly good ideas. This is why valueception, the ability to perceive values, is so important here. The stories we tell must draw from a different values dynamic. They must be part of a different meta-narrative that doesn't play to our lower values in order to drive positive change. We have at our disposal, throughout ancient history, different cultures and different traditions who are able to create positive behaviours through storytelling. There is another way to regulate, motivate, inspire, engage audiences into positive change that doesn't draw from the logic of the marketing paradigm, nor draw from the neoliberal values that have permeated our culture. There is a way to bring our audience to the highest stages of the motivation continuum. There is another perspective here to address the psychological conditions needed to bring about real change. This is why we can confidently turn to master storytelling, which is the ability to work on meta-narratives that draw from a different motivational engine, to drive everything that we do. This is a storytelling paradigm, and it helps to awaken the necessary values needed for real change. It works with self-regulation, creating the conditions for long-term behaviour change. This is the engine we should be using if we want to address the meta-crisis. Until we do so, we will keep going around in circles trying to find rational solutions to a relational problem. The two will never marry, and will always feel like one step forward and two steps back. Instead, we can find a way to propel new ways forward by working with the values, purpose and nature of the right hemisphere. Only then can we bring real change to our world. The journey to becoming a master storyteller takes time, as there's so much unlearning to do. Master storytelling can only really work if we are prepared to leave old paradigms behind and to develop the following 3 core skill sets: valueception, our ability to see, understand and work with the nature of values in their flow state; motivation, how to work with the dynamics of self-regulation and intrinsic motivation; and intrinsic purpose, how to deal with the self-transcendent aspect of the self, which is essential if we are to awaken the self-transcendent values of caring for our nature, social justice and peace. These new skill sets can provide some profound insights into human motivation and behaviours that can help us overcome some of the most stubborn problems we face when it comes to addressing the underlying psychological drivers behind the meta-crisis. Changing the engine from the marketing paradigm to a new engine, the storytelling paradigm offers us a substantive shift from the old story to a new story. Who would have thought that telling a new story was a motivational engine, an engine that we can adapt to all aspects of our work to help drive meaningful change? I think until we do so, our society, our culture and our values will always realign back to the old story. Telling a new story, or rather using a different motivation engine, can shift the dominant meta-narratives that keep us trapped in a dominant left hemisphere attention. It is not an oversimplification to say that the meta-crisis is a symptom of a toxic meta-narrative, one that has been shaped by the values of some toxic paradigms, including the marketing paradigm. Changing this engine by using a new motivational engine helps us to get out of the mess that we're in. But to do so, we need to draw upon wisdom traditions, wisdom literature, wisdom thinking, for they all say something completely different at the meta-narrative level than what the marketing paradigm says. This is the one thing we and our culture refuses to accept, that we cannot avoid suffering. We cannot buy our way out of suffering. We cannot live without suffering. Instead, they all say we transcend and include suffering, and in doing so, we are transformed. The values needed for real change are awakened, and our lives are no longer about ourselves, but we are about something greater, something that transcends all of this. This is a spiritual dimension that is missing from our current motivational models. This is a spiritual dimension missing from most values models that fail to recognize the fact that all values awaken when they're in service to something beyond themselves. This is the spiritual dimension of intrinsic purpose, which is not about achieving an outcome, but about awakening to a deeper part of ourselves. The marketing paradigm prefers to keep us passive, immature, needy. The storytelling paradigm thrives when it gives us agency, inner maturity and resilience. Working with this new model means that we need to learn how to become a master storyteller, so that we know how to work with and integrate into our work the higher stages of the motivation continuum, how to work with intrinsic values, and how to draw people forward using intrinsic purpose. If we want to address this issue of the meta-crisis, then our first step is towards abandoning the old engine and embracing the new. This is how master storytelling can help us solve some of the world's most complex problems.